April 15, 1944, Ramatelli Air Base, Italy. As dawn broke over the airfield, Technical Sergeant William Pressure Jackson squinted against the rising sun, watching the P-51 Mustangs of the 382nd Fighter Group line up on the tarmac. The red-tailed aircraft looked perfect, just as they always did under his supervision. Little did the young mechanic know that in just 3 weeks, his unconventional thinking would transform the combat effectiveness of the entire group and save dozens of lives. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how one man's defiance of conventional wisdom gave America's first black military aviators the edge they desperately needed in the skies over Nazi Germany. The early morning air carried a chill that cut through Technical Sergeant Jackson's uniform as he performed his final inspection on Lieutenant James Harrison's P-51D Mustang. At 24, Jackson was already considered one of the finest mechanics in the 382nd Fighter Group, known to pilots and ground crew alike as Pressure for his uncanny ability to diagnose engine problems by sound alone. He had a gift for machines that bordered on the supernatural, as if he could hear them speaking to him in a language only he understood. "She's purring like a kitten today, Pressure," Lieutenant Harrison said, approaching from behind. He was a tall, lean man with intense eyes that had seen too much in his 23 years. Harrison was one of the veterans of the group, with over 40 combat missions already under his belt. "Should be, sir. I was up half the night balancing those cylinders. You had some uneven firing in number 3 and 4 yesterday," Jackson replied without looking up from the engine. His dark hands, stained with oil and hydraulic fluid, moved with practiced precision over the complicated machinery. Harrison chuckled. "I swear you know these engines better than North American aviation does." He patted the fuselage of the fighter affectionately. "Keep her running, sweet. We're escorting B-17s to Berlin today." Jackson finally looked up, his expression serious. "Berlin? That's pushing the range limits, sir, even with the drop tanks." "Tell me about it," Harrison sighed. "Colonel Davis says intelligence is reporting a new assembly plant that needs to be hit before it gets into full production. Top priority." Jackson nodded, understanding the gravity of the mission. The 382nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, had earned their reputation as one of the finest escort groups in the European theater. Their distinctive red-tailed P-51s were becoming a welcome sight to bomber crews, who had taken to calling them the Red Tail Angels. But the men who flew those planes knew the truth. They weren't angels. They were simply men fighting not only against the Luftwaffe, but also against the prejudice and discrimination that followed them even into war. "I'll double-check the fuel mixture settings," Jackson said. "Might be able to squeeze a little more range out of her." "Thanks, Pressure, I appreciate that." Harrison donned his leather flying helmet, fastening the chin strap. "See you when we get back." As Jackson watched Harrison climb into the cockpit, a knot formed in his stomach. Berlin was at the absolute limit of the P-51's range, even with the external drop tanks. If the fighters encountered heavy resistance and were forced to engage in extended combat maneuvers, they might not have enough fuel to make it home. It wasn't the first time the 382nd had been assigned the most dangerous missions, and Jackson knew it wouldn't be the last. Across the airfield, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was conducting a final briefing with his pilots. At 31, Davis was already a legend. West Point graduate, son of the first black general in the U.S. Army, and now commander of the 382nd Fighter Group. His leadership had been instrumental in transforming the group into one of the most effective fighter escort units in the 15th Air Force. "Gentlemen, I don't need to tell you how important today's mission is," Davis said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "The bombers are hitting a factory complex, producing components for the new Me-262 jet fighters. If the Germans get those planes into full production, our bombers will face a threat unlike anything they've encountered before." The pilots nodded solemnly. They had heard rumors about the German jet fighters, aircraft capable of speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, nearly 100 mph faster than their P-51s. "Our primary mission remains escort," Davis continued. "Protect those bombers at all costs. The weather over the target is expected to be clear, but we may hit cloud cover on the return leg. Lieutenant Watkins? Captain James Watkins, the group's navigation officer, stepped forward. Fuel management will be critical today, gentlemen. We're looking at a round trip of just over 1,500 miles. With external tanks, you have a maximum range of about 650 miles, but that's under optimal conditions. Straight and level flight at economical cruising speed. Combat maneuvers will cut into that margin significantly. A low murmur ran through the assembled pilots. Everyone understood what Watkins was saying. If they encountered heavy resistance and had to engage in extended dogfighting, some of them might not have enough fuel to make it home. Questions? Davis asked, looking around the group. Lieutenant Howard Bohr raised his hand. Sir, what's the contingency plan if we run short on fuel? There's an emergency landing strip at Foggia we can use if absolutely necessary, Davis replied, but I expect everyone to make it back to base. Manage your fuel carefully, break off combat if you have to, but don't abandon the bombers until their mission is complete. Clear? Yes, sir, the pilots responded in unison. Very well. Man your aircraft. Take off in 15 minutes. As the pilots dispersed, Jackson finished his work on Harrison's P-51. He closed the cowling and gave the pilot a thumbs up. Harrison returned the gesture from the cockpit, his face now obscured by his oxygen mask. One by one, the engines of 16 P-51 Mustangs roared to life, sending clouds of exhaust billowing across the tarmac. Jackson stepped back, joining the other ground crew members as they watched their aircraft prepare for takeoff. Beside him stood Master Sergeant Lewis Wilson, the chief of maintenance for the group. At 42, Wilson was one of the oldest men in the unit, with 20 years of experience working on aircraft engines. He had been a mechanic for civilian airlines before the war, one of the few black men to hold such a position. When the Army Air Forces began recruiting mechanics for the Tuskegee program, Wilson had been one of the first to volunteer. "They're pushing those boys to the limit," Wilson muttered, his eyes on the aircraft as they taxied toward the runway. "Berlin's a long way," Jackson agreed. "I don't like the fuel margins." Wilson shook his head. "Not much we can do about that. The P-51's got the longest legs of any fighter in the theater, but even it has limits." Jackson's brow furrowed. "You know, I've been thinking about that. The Army manual says the optimal fuel-air mixture for the Merlin engine is 14. 7-1, but I've been experimenting with leaner mixtures on the test stand. If we could safely run them at 16-1, we might be able to extend their range by another 50 miles or so." Wilson shot him a skeptical look. "The manual is the manual for a reason, Pressure. Lean that mixture too much and you risk detonation, especially at high altitude. You could blow out the cylinders or damage the valves." "I know the risks," Jackson replied, his eyes still on the aircraft now taking off in pairs. "But I also know these engines, Lewis. The Packard-built Merlins are a little different from the Rolls-Royce originals. They can handle a leaner mix if it's done right." "Maybe so," Wilson conceded. "But today isn't the day to test that theory. Let's hope they all make it back on standard settings." As the last of the P-51s disappeared into the eastern sky, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a better way. The lives of those men depended on the performance of the machines he maintained, and if there was a way to give them an extra edge, he was determined to find it. High above the Italian countryside, the 16 P-51 Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group climbed steadily toward their rendezvous with the bomber formation. In the cockpit of his aircraft, which he had named Macon Bell after his Georgia hometown, Lieutenant Harrison settled into the familiar routine of a long-distance mission. He checked his instruments, adjusted his oxygen flow, and scanned the sky for the bombers they were assigned to protect. At 20,000 feet, the world below seemed peaceful, the scars of war invisible from this altitude. The Mediterranean sparkled in the distance, its blue waters stretching toward the horizon. Harrison allowed himself a moment to appreciate the view before returning his attention to the task at hand. The mission to Berlin would push both men and machines to their limits, and there was no room for distraction. "Red leader to red flight, check in!" Colonel Davis's voice crackled over the radio. One by one, the pilots of the 382nd reported in, confirming their positions in the formation. As the most junior officer in the flight, Harrison was the last to respond. "Red 6, in position and ready," he said, pressing the transmit button on his control stick. Roger, Red Flight. Bomber formation should be visible at our 12 o'clock in approximately 5 minutes. Stay sharp. Harrison adjusted his trim and settled in for the long flight ahead. In the distance, he could make out the first specks that would soon resolve into the massive formation of B-17 flying fortresses they were assigned to protect. The heavy bombers, each carrying a payload of explosives destined for German war industries, were the primary target for Luftwaffe fighters. Without escort, their losses had been staggering during the early years of the strategic bombing campaign. The introduction of long-range fighters like the P-51 had changed the equation, allowing the bombers to reach targets deep inside Germany with protective escorts all the way to the target and back. As the P-51s approached the bomber formation, Harrison could see that they weren't the only escorts assigned to the mission. High above the bombers, the distinctive silhouettes of P-47 Thunderbolts patrolled the sky, while off to the west, another group of P-51s from the 4th Fighter Group maintained their station. Red Leader to Red Flight, take up positions on the left flank of the bomber formation, Davis ordered. Keep your eyes open. Intelligence reports indicate we may encounter Me-109s and FW-190s in the Leipzig area. Harrison acknowledged the order and guided his P-51 into position alongside the massive B-17s. From his cockpit, he could see the gunners and the bombers tracking his approach, then relaxing as they recognized the distinctive red tail of his aircraft. The 302nd had earned a reputation among bomber crews for their discipline and determination, staying with the bombers when other escort groups sometimes went off hunting enemy aircraft. In the lead bomber, Carolina Moon, Colonel Robert Maxwell watched the P-51s take up their escort positions with approval. At 36, Maxwell was a veteran of 27 bombing missions over Europe, commanding the 305th Bomb Group's High Squadron. He had seen too many of his aircraft fall to enemy fighters during the dark days before long-range escorts became available. "Red tails are with us today," his co-pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Warren, observed. "That's good news." Maxwell nodded. "They stay with the bombers better than most. I've never seen them break off to chase bandits." The bomber formation continued eastward, crossing into German airspace near Leipzig. So far, the mission had proceeded without incident, but Maxwell knew that would change. The Luftwaffe rarely allowed bomber formations to penetrate this deeply into their territory without a response. His prediction proved correct just minutes later, when the radio crackled with the first warning. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high. Multiple 109s diving on the formation." In his P-51, Harrison spotted the German fighters immediately. A dozen Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving out of the sun toward the vulnerable bomber formation. Without hesitation, he pushed his throttle forward and turned to intercept, along with the rest of Red Flight. "Red 6 engaging," he reported, as he lined up behind one of the attacking 109s. The German pilot, suddenly aware of the P-51 on his tail, broke off his attack run and entered a tight turn, trying to shake his pursuer. But Harrison stayed with him, using the superior low-speed handling of the P-51 to maintain his position. When the range closed to less than 300 yards, Harrison squeezed the trigger on his control stick, sending a stream of 50 caliber rounds toward the German fighter. Several bullets struck the 109's engine cowling, sending puffs of smoke trailing from the damaged aircraft. The German pilot rolled into a steep dive, attempting to escape, but Harrison followed, keeping his gun sight fixed on the enemy plane. A second burst from his machine gun struck the 109's cockpit, and the aircraft suddenly rolled over and plummeted toward the ground, trailing smoke and flames. Harrison pulled up, scanning the sky for his next opponent, aware that in the heat of combat, he was burning precious fuel that he would need for the long return journey. All around him, the sky had erupted into a chaotic battlefield, with P-51s and German fighters twisting and turning in deadly aerial ballet. The bomber formation continued onward, gunners firing at any enemy aircraft that came within range, while the fighter escorts worked to keep the Luftwaffe at bay. For 20 minutes the battle raged, with aircraft from both sides falling from the sky. The 322nd claimed 8 confirmed kills against the loss of 1 P-51, but the engagement had cost them dearly in terms of fuel consumption. As the German fighters finally withdrew, Harrison checked his fuel gauges with growing concern. The combat had forced him to use his main tanks earlier than planned, and he calculated that he was now dangerously close to the limit of his range for the return journey. He wasn't the only one. Over the radio, he could hear other pilots reporting similar concerns to Colonel Davis. "Red Leader, this is Red 3. Fuel state becoming critical. Request permission to return to base after the target." "Negative, Red 3, Davis replied firmly. "We stay with the bombers all the way home. Drop to economical cruise power and conserve what you have." Harrison knew Davis was right. Their mission was to protect the bombers, and they couldn't abandon them just because the situation had become difficult. Still, as they approached Berlin, he couldn't help but think of Jackson's comments about fuel mixtures and range. If the mechanic was right, a simple adjustment might have given them the margin they needed today. The bombers reached Berlin without further incident, dropping their payloads on the aircraft component factory with reasonable accuracy, despite heavy anti-aircraft fire from the ground. As they turned for home, Harrison's fuel gauge showed less than half tanks, not enough for the return journey if they encountered more resistance. His concerns proved prophetic when, just west of Dresden, another group of German fighters attacked. This time, it was a mixed formation of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, nearly 20 aircraft in all, determined to exact revenge for the bombing of the capital. "Red Flight, we have no choice but to engage," Davis ordered. "Keep it brief, make your passes count, and get back to the bombers ASAP." Harrison acknowledged the order and turned to meet the threat, knowing that every minute spent in combat further reduced his chances of making it home. He managed to damage one Fw-190 and drive off another, but the engagement lasted nearly 15 minutes before the Germans finally broke away. By the time they crossed back into Allied-controlled airspace, 5 P-51s of the 302nd were running on fumes, their pilots nursing their aircraft, along with every fuel-saving technique they knew. Harrison was among them, his engine occasionally coughing as the fuel supply became inconsistent. "Red 6 to Red Leader," he radioed. "I'm not going to make it back to Ramitelli. Request permission to divert to Foggia." "Understood, Red 6, Davis replied. "Anyone else who needs to divert, do so now. The rest of us will continue escort." In the end, 7 of the 16 P-51s were forced to land at the emergency airfield at Foggia, their tanks completely dry by the time they touched down. It was a sobering experience for all involved, highlighting the razor-thin margins under which they operated. When the remaining aircraft of the 302nd finally landed at Ramitelli later that afternoon, the mood was somber despite the successful completion of their mission. They had protected the bombers, shot down enemy aircraft, and bombed the target. But the fuel situation had very nearly resulted in disaster. As Jackson helped secure Harrison's P-51 after its return from Foggia the following morning, the pilot recounted the mission in detail. "We were running on fumes, pressure," Harrison explained, watching as Jackson checked over the engine. "If we'd had to fight our way out of Germany, some of us wouldn't have made it back at all." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that problem, sir. I believe there's a way to increase your range without compromising performance." "I'm all ears," Harrison replied, his interest piqued. Another 50 miles of range could make all the difference on these deep penetration missions. Jackson looked around to ensure no one else was within earshot before continuing. "It's about the fuel-air mixture, sir. The Army manual specifies 14:7:1 as the optimal ratio, but that's based on standard aviation gasoline. The high-octane fuel we're getting now can handle a leaner mixture, especially at cruise power settings." Harrison frowned. "Wouldn't that risk engine damage? Detonation is no joke at high altitude." "It would," Jackson admitted, "if we just leaned out the mixture without other changes. But I've been experimenting with a modified carburetor setting that compensates for the increased altitude. Essentially, it gradually leans the mixture as you climb, then enriches it automatically during power changes." "And you've tested this?" Harrison asked skeptically. "On the test stand, yes. It showed a fuel consumption reduction of about 12% with no loss of power or signs of detonation. That translates to maybe 75 miles of additional range." Harrison whistled low. "That could be the difference between making it home and bailing out over enemy territory." Have you talked to Colonel Davis about this? Jackson's expression clouded. Not yet. Master Sergeant Wilson thinks it's too risky to deviate from the manual. He says if anything goes wrong, I'll be court-martialed for endangering aircraft and pilots. He might be right, Harrison conceded. But if it works... Look, let me talk to some of the other pilots. If we can get a few volunteers to test your modification under controlled conditions, maybe we can build a case for wider implementation. Over the next week, Jackson refined his modification, working late into the night on a test engine in the maintenance hangar. He had been fascinated by engines since childhood, taking apart his father's truck engine at the age of 10 and successfully reassembling it. That natural talent had led him to technical school in Atlanta, where he had excelled despite the limitations imposed by segregation. When the war came, he had volunteered immediately, seeing an opportunity to use his skills in service to his country. The Tuskegee program had been both a blessing and a curse, a chance to prove what black mechanics and pilots could achieve, but also a constant battle against the prejudice and low expectations of the military establishment. Every success had to be twice as impressive. Every failure scrutinized and often attributed to race rather than the normal challenges of warfare. Jackson's modification was simple in concept, but complex in execution. By adjusting the float level in the carburetor and recalibrating the mixture control, he created a system that could safely run a leaner mixture at cruise power settings, while automatically enriching when power was increased for combat maneuvers. The challenge was making the transition smooth and reliable under all conditions. On April 23, 1944, the first test flight was conducted. Lieutenant Harrison, along with 3 other volunteer pilots, took off in modified P-51s for a 4-hour training mission designed to simulate combat conditions. They pushed their aircraft through a series of high-altitude maneuvers, combat simulations, and extended cruise periods, carefully monitoring engine performance throughout. When they landed, the results were promising. The modified aircraft had consumed an average of 8% less fuel than standard P-51s flying the same profile, with no noticeable loss of performance or signs of engine stress. But Jackson knew that a single successful test wasn't enough to overcome the ingrained resistance to change within the military hierarchy. Colonel Davis, who had observed the test flights with interest, called Jackson to his office the following morning. The commander's quarters were sparse, with only a desk, a few chairs, and a map of Europe on the wall marked with pins showing the locations of recent missions. "Sergeant Jackson," Davis said, gesturing for him to sit. "Lieutenant Harrison tells me this fuel modification of yours could significantly extend our combat radius." "Yes, sir," Jackson replied, sitting at attention. "Based on yesterday's test, I believe we could safely add between 60 and 75 miles to the operational range of our P-51s. Davis nodded thoughtfully. "That's significant, especially for the Berlin missions." He paused, studying Jackson's face. "But you understand why Master Sergeant Wilson is concerned, don't you? We're operating very expensive aircraft with very valuable men inside them. Deviating from established procedures carries risks." "I do understand that, sir," Jackson acknowledged. "But with all due respect, the established procedures were written for earlier engines and lower-octane fuels. The Packard Merlins we're running now can handle the leaner mixture, especially with the compensating adjustments I've made." Davis leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about your background, Sergeant. Where did you learn about aircraft engines?" "Atlanta Technical School, sir. I was in the top 3% of my class. After that, I worked at a small airfield outside Macon, maintaining civilian aircraft. When the war started, I volunteered and was assigned to Tuskegee." "And this modification, it's your own design?" "Yes, sir. Based on principles I learned in school, but adapted specifically for the Merlin engine and our operational conditions." Davis was silent for a long moment, considering. Finally, he spoke. "We have another Berlin mission scheduled for the day after tomorrow. 8th Air Force is hitting the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt first, then continuing to Berlin while we provide escort. Maximum range mission, high threat environment." He stood and walked to the map on the wall, pointing to the route. "If your modification works as advertised, it could make a critical difference. But if it fails..." He left the sentence unfinished, the implications clear. "I understand the stakes, sir," Jackson said firmly. I wouldn't propose this if I wasn't confident in the engineering. I'd stake my own life on it. Davis turned back to face him. That's commendable, Sergeant, but it's not your life that will be at stake, it's the lives of my pilots. He sighed. That said, we're fighting a war where the margins between success and failure, between life and death, are often razor thin. Sometimes calculated risks are necessary. What are you suggesting, sir? A compromise. Modify 4 more aircraft, volunteers only, for the Berlin mission. That will give us 8 modified P-51s total. If they perform as expected under actual combat conditions, we'll consider implementing the change across the entire group. Jackson straightened in his chair. Thank you for the opportunity, sir. I won't let you down. See that you don't, Sergeant, Davis replied gravely. Because if anything goes wrong, it won't just be your career at stake. The entire Tuskegee program will come under scrutiny. There are still plenty of people in the Army Air Forces who believe black men have no place in the cockpit or the maintenance hangar. We can't afford to give them ammunition. I understand completely, sir. Good. Coordinate with Master Sergeant Wilson. I want him fully briefed on the modifications and involved in the implementation. Clear? Yes, sir. Dismissed. As Jackson left the colonel's office, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about proving a technical theory anymore. It was about potentially saving the lives of men he had come to respect and admire, and about proving once again that the men of the 302nd were equal to any challenge, technical or tactical. Master Sergeant Wilson was less than enthusiastic when Jackson informed him of Colonel Davis's decision. This is a mistake, Wilson said bluntly as they stood in the maintenance hangar later that day. You're asking me to sign off on a modification that violates every maintenance directive we've been given. Not violates, Jackson corrected. Improves upon. The directives were written before we had access to 100-octane fuel and before we were flying missions to Berlin. Wilson shook his head. If an engine fails at 30,000 feet over Germany because of this improvement, it won't just be the pilot who pays the price. It'll be ammunition for every racist officer who's been looking for an excuse to shut us down. That's exactly what Colonel Davis said, Jackson admitted. But he also recognized that the potential benefits outweigh the risks. We're losing pilots to fuel exhaustion, Lewis. If this works, it could save lives. Wilson sighed heavily. Fine. Show me exactly what you're doing to these carburetors. If I'm going to be court-martialed alongside you, I at least want to understand the technical details of why. For the next 8 hours, Jackson and Wilson worked side by side, modifying the fuel systems of 4 additional P-51s. Despite his initial reluctance, Wilson quickly grasped the principles behind Jackson's innovation and even suggested several refinements to the installation process. By midnight, all 8 aircraft were ready, their engines run up and tested on the ground to ensure proper operation. As they finished the last inspection, Wilson grudgingly admitted, "It's sound engineering, Pressure. I still think it's a risk, but I can't find any technical flaws in your approach." "High praise coming from you," Jackson replied with a tired smile. "Don't let it go to your head," Wilson grumbled. "If this works, every fighter group in the theater will want the modification, and guess who'll get stuck implementing it?" Jackson laughed. "I can think of worse problems to have." The following day was spent briefing the pilots who would fly the modified aircraft on the specifics of the changes and how to monitor for any signs of engine trouble. Lieutenant Harrison, now the unofficial leader of what the other pilots had dubbed Pressure's guinea pigs, paid particular attention to the technical details. "The key is to follow the power management protocol exactly," Jackson emphasized during the briefing. "Lean the mixture gradually during climb. Maintain the specified setting during cruise, and always enrich before increasing power for combat. If you hear any detonation, any pinging or knocking from the engine, enrich immediately regardless of the situation." Harrison nodded. "We've got it, Pressure. Anything else we should watch for?" "Engine temperature," Wilson interjected. "A leaner mixture can lead to higher operating temperatures. If you see the cylinder head temperature gauge moving into the upper third of the range, enrich slightly even if you're not hearing detonation." The pilots absorbed the instructions carefully, asking questions about various scenarios they might encounter. By the end of the briefing, Jackson was confident they understood both the potential benefits and the risks of the modification. That night, as he lay on his cot in the enlisted men's quarters, Jackson found sleep elusive. His mind kept running through calculations, questioning his assumptions, and imagining worst-case scenarios. Had he overlooked something? Was there a condition he hadn't accounted for? The responsibility for the lives of 8 men weighed heavily upon him. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and walked out to the flight line where the P-51s sat in neat rows, their aluminum skins gleaming softly in the moonlight. He approached Harrison's aircraft, make and bell, and ran his hand along the smooth metal of the fuselage. It was more than just a machine to him. It was a symphony of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity, and now potentially a validation of his own technical expertise. "Can't sleep either," a voice asked from behind him. Jackson turned to see Lieutenant Harrison approaching, still dressed in his uniform despite the late hour. "Just double-checking everything, sir," Jackson replied. Harrison nodded in understanding. "I know the feeling. Before my first combat mission, I must have reviewed the flight plan 100 times." They stood in silence for a moment, both men contemplating the aircraft before them. "You know," Harrison finally said, "when I was training at Tuskegee, one of the instructors told me something I've never forgotten. He said that in combat, it's not always about having the best aircraft or the most ammunition. It's about having an edge, something unexpected, something the enemy hasn't accounted for." "And you think this modification might be that edge?" Jackson asked. Harrison smiled. "I know it is. The Luftwaffe expects us to turn back when our fuel runs low. They count on it. What happens when we don't? When we can stay in the fight longer than they anticipated? That's how wars are won, pressure, by changing the equation just enough to throw the enemy's calculations off." Jackson considered this. "I hadn't thought of it that way. To me, it was just a technical problem to solve." "And that's why you're good at what you do," Harrison replied. "You focus on the problem right in front of you, not the larger implications. But make no mistake, what you've done here could change the entire dynamic of our escort missions." "Assuming it works," Jackson said cautiously. "It will work," Harrison said with conviction. "I can feel it. Now get some sleep, Sergeant. Tomorrow's a big day for both of us." As Harrison walked away, Jackson took one last look at the P-51. The lieutenant was right. Tomorrow would be a test, not just of the technical modification, but of the principle behind it. Sometimes victory came not from grand strategies or overwhelming force, but from small, unexpected advantages that tipped the balance just enough to make a difference. The morning of April 25th dawned clear and cool, with a light breeze from the west, perfect flying weather. As the pilots of the 302nd gathered for their pre-mission briefing, there was a palpable tension in the air. The mission to Berlin following the bombing of Schweinfurt would be one of the longest and most dangerous they had undertaken. Colonel Davis, standing before a large map of Central Europe, outlined the details of the operation. "Gentlemen, today's mission is a 2-phase operation. The 8th Air Force will be hitting the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt with a force of 200 B-17s. Following that attack, half of the bomber force will continue to Berlin to strike the Siemens electrical equipment plant, which intelligence indicates is producing guidance systems for V-2 rockets." He traced the route on the map with a pointer. "We will rendezvous with the bomber stream here, over northern Italy, and provide escort all the way to Schweinfurt. The 4th and 356 fighter groups will relieve us for the leg from Schweinfurt to Berlin, while we refuel at a forward base in Luxembourg. We will then rejoin the bombers for their return journey from Berlin to Luxembourg, and finally back to Italy." The complex choreography of the mission was necessary because of the extreme distances involved. Even with external fuel tanks, the P-51s couldn't escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back without refueling. The forward base in Luxembourg, recently captured from German forces, provided a vital link in the logistical chain. "Questions?" Davis asked, looking around the room. Captain Marcus Williams, one of the squadron commanders, raised his hand. "Sir, what's the intelligence assessment of Luftwaffe response?" "Heavy," Davis replied grimly. "The Germans know the strategic importance of both targets. We expect significant opposition, particularly between Schweinfurt and Berlin. The bomber force will be at its most vulnerable during the transition between escort groups. There were no further questions. The pilots understood the gravity of the mission and the challenges they would face. As they dispersed to their aircraft, the 8 men flying the modified P-51s gathered briefly around Jackson for any last-minute instructions. "Remember," he told them, "this is still experimental. If you encounter any abnormal engine behavior, revert to standard mixture settings immediately. Your lives are more important than proving a theory." The pilots nodded in agreement, their faces serious but determined. They had all volunteered for this test, understanding both the potential benefits and the risks involved. If Jackson's modification worked as expected, it could significantly enhance their combat effectiveness. If it failed, they were trained to handle the situation and bring their aircraft home safely if possible. As the P-51s of the 302nd Fighter Group took off from Ramitelli in pairs, climbing into the clear Italian sky, Jackson watched from the edge of the runway, his heart in his throat. The next several hours would either validate his work or prove it a dangerous miscalculation. Beside him, Master Sergeant Wilson watched with equal intensity. "They'll be all right," he said, though whether he was reassuring Jackson or himself wasn't clear. "Those boys know how to handle their planes, modified or not." Jackson nodded silently, his eyes still on the diminishing shapes of the fighters as they formed up and headed north to meet the bomber stream. Now all they could do was wait and hope. High above the cloud-streaked sky of northern Italy, Lieutenant Harrison settled his P-51 into position on the right flank of the bomber formation. The massive B-17s, flying in tight box formations of 12 aircraft each, created an impressive sight against the blue backdrop. From each bomber bristled machine guns, their barrels tracking constantly for the appearance of enemy fighters. In the cockpit of Macon Bell, Harrison ran through a mental checklist of the modified fuel system procedures. So far, the engine was performing exactly as Jackson had predicted, maintaining smooth operation despite the leaner fuel-air mixture. Harrison had been monitoring his fuel consumption closely since takeoff and was pleased to note that it was indeed lower than normal for this stage of the flight. Red leader to red flight. Maintain escort positions through the Alps. Weather reports indicate potential cloud cover over southern Germany. Colonel Davis's voice crackled over the radio. Harrison acknowledged the order and adjusted his heading slightly to maintain proper spacing with the bomber he was escorting. Below, the rugged terrain of the Alps was coming into view, snow-capped peaks reaching toward the sky. It was a beautiful sight, one that might have been enjoyable under different circumstances. But Harrison knew that soon they would be over enemy territory, where every moment brought the possibility of combat. The journey to Schweinfurt was surprisingly uneventful. The expected Luftwaffe opposition failed to materialize, leading some pilots to speculate that the German fighters were being held in reserve to protect the more strategic target in Berlin. Whatever the reason, the bomber force reached Schweinfurt without incident, dropping their payloads on the ball-bearing factories with reasonable accuracy despite moderate anti-aircraft fire from the ground. As planned, half of the bomber force turned for home, while the remainder set course for Berlin, accompanied by the 4th and 356th Fighter Groups. The 332nd peeled away toward Luxembourg for refueling, their first phase of the mission complete. At the forward airbase, hastily established on a captured German airfield, the P-51s of the 382nd landed in sequence, taxiing to refueling points where ground crews waited to replenish their tanks. Harrison was one of the first to land, bringing his aircraft to a stop near a fuel truck operated by a surprised-looking Army Air Forces sergeant. "Need a full tank, Sergeant," Harrison said as he climbed down from the cockpit. "We're headed back out to escort the Berlin bombers home." The sergeant's surprise turned to admiration. "You boys are going back up? That's a hell of a long mission." "All in a day's work," Harrison replied with a grin, though in truth he was feeling the strain of the extended flight. The cramped cockpit of the P-51 was not designed for comfort, and even with the modified fuel system, the Berlin mission would push the limits of both man and machine. As the ground crew refueled his aircraft, Harrison took the opportunity to confer with the other pilots flying the modified P-51s. All reported similar results: smooth engine operation, reduced fuel consumption, and no signs of detonation or overheating. It was a promising start, But the real test would come during the return escort from Berlin, when they might be forced into high-energy combat maneuvers. 40 minutes later, the 322nd was airborne again, climbing to altitude and setting course for Berlin to intercept the returning bomber formation. Harrison checked his watch anxiously. If the bombing mission had proceeded according to schedule, they should rendezvous with the bombers approximately 50 miles west of Berlin. But combat rarely adhered to schedules, and there was always the possibility that they would miss the connection, leaving the bombers vulnerable to attack. His concerns proved unfounded. As they approached the calculated interception point, Harrison spotted the bomber formation in the distance, still maintaining good order despite visible damage to several aircraft. More concerning was the swarm of tiny dots circling the bombers. Luftwaffe fighters, at least 30 of them, engaged in a determined attack on the vulnerable B-17s. Red leader to red flight, bandits at 12 o'clock. Looks like a mixed force of 109s and 190s. Move to intercept, Colonel Davis ordered, his voice calm despite the imminent danger. The P-51s of the 322nd accelerated toward the battle, their pilots focused on the task ahead. Harrison moved his mixture control to the rich position as instructed by Jackson, ensuring his engine would have maximum power available for combat. The Merlin responded instantly, its note deepening as the fuel mixture enriched. Red 6 engaging. Harrison reported as he selected a Focke-Wulf 190 that was lining up for an attack on one of the trailing B-17s. The German pilot, intent on his target, didn't notice the approaching P-51 until it was too late. Harrison's first burst of machine gun fire struck the 190's right wing and fuselage, sending it into a violent roll away from the bomber. The German pilot was skilled, however, and quickly recovered, turning to face his attacker. What followed was a classic dogfight, both aircraft twisting and turning through the sky in a lethal dance. The FW-190 had the advantage in roll rate and diving speed, but Harrison's P-51 could turn tighter and climb better. For several minutes, neither pilot could gain a decisive advantage. Finally, Harrison managed to get on the German's tail during a climbing turn, the 1D-90's energy bleeding off as it tried to escape. A well-aimed burst of fire struck the enemy aircraft's engine, which immediately began streaming black smoke. The German pilot rolled inverted and bailed out, his parachute blooming white against the blue sky as his aircraft plummeted toward the ground. Harrison had no time to celebrate the victory. Already another German fighter was approaching, this one a Bf-109G with the yellow nose marking of JG-26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite units. Harrison turned to meet the threat, aware that in the high-energy maneuvering of combat, he was burning fuel at a prodigious rate. Under normal circumstances, such extended combat might have forced him to break off and head for home. But with the modified fuel system, he still had a comfortable margin. Around him, the sky was filled with combat. The pilots of the 322nd were heavily outnumbered, but fought with determination. Their primary goal not to score victories, but to protect the bombers. Gradually, the German attacks began to slacken as the Luftwaffe pilots, themselves operating at the limits of their range, were forced to turn for home or risk running out of fuel. By the time they crossed into Allied-controlled airspace over Luxembourg, the 332nd had lost 2 aircraft to enemy action, but had claimed 7 confirmed kills and protected the bomber formation from what could have been devastating losses. More significantly, none of the pilots flying the modified P-51s had been forced to divert due to fuel concerns, despite the extended combat. As they escorted the bombers back toward Italy, Harrison checked his fuel gauges with a sense of amazement. Despite the intense combat and the long distance covered, he still had nearly a quarter tank remaining, enough for another hour of flight at cruise power. Jackson's modification had performed beyond expectations. When the 322nd finally landed at Ramitelli late that afternoon, the mood was a mixture of exhaustion and elation. The mission had been a success, with minimal losses considering the distance covered and the opposition encountered. More importantly for Jackson, all 8 of the modified P-51s had returned safely, their pilots unanimous in their praise for the improved fuel efficiency. Colonel Davis, who had flown one of the standard P-51s during the mission, was quick to recognize the significance of the results. After debriefing the pilots, He called Jackson to his office once again. "Your modification performed exceptionally, Sergeant," Davis said without preamble. "Lieutenant Harrison reports that he landed with 37 gallons still in his tanks. That's nearly an hour of additional flight time compared to the standard configuration." Jackson tried to maintain a professional demeanor, but couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. "Thank you, sir. I'm pleased the system performed as expected." "Better than expected, according to my pilots," Davis replied. "Captain Williams had to engage 3 separate enemy aircraft during the mission and still had enough fuel to make it home comfortably. Under standard configuration, he would almost certainly have had to divert to a forward base." "The combat performance was the real test, sir," Jackson acknowledged. "I was confident about the cruise efficiency, but combat maneuvers are much harder to predict." Davis leaned forward, his expression serious. "I'm authorizing immediate implementation of your modification across the entire group. Every P-51 in the 382nd will be updated within the next week. Master Sergeant Wilson will supervise the work, with you as technical lead." "Thank you for the opportunity, sir," Jackson said, standing a little straighter. "You've earned it, Sergeant. And there's more. I've submitted a formal report to 15th Air Force Headquarters detailing the modification and its benefits. I'm also recommending you for the Bronze Star for technical innovation under combat conditions." Jackson was momentarily speechless. The Bronze Star was a significant recognition rarely awarded to enlisted personnel, let alone for technical contributions. I don't know what to say, sir." "You don't need to say anything, Sergeant. Your work speaks for itself. What you've done will save lives, not just in our group, but potentially throughout the Army Air Forces, once your modification is standardized." Davis stood and extended his hand. "Well done, Technical Sergeant Jackson. The 382nd is fortunate to have you in its ranks." Jackson shook the colonel's hand, a sense of pride washing over him. It was a validation not just of his technical skills, but of the principle that had driven the Tuskegee program from the beginning. Given equal opportunity and resources, Black Americans could contribute at the highest levels in any field, including the technical complexities of modern warfare. In the weeks that followed, Jackson's fuel system modification was implemented across the entire 332nd Fighter Group, with impressive results. The group's operational range increased by an average of 70 miles, allowing them to escort bombers deeper into enemy territory and engage in more extended combat when necessary. Mission abort rates due to fuel concerns dropped dramatically, and pilot confidence soared with the knowledge that they had a greater margin of safety for the return journey. Word of the modification spread rapidly through the Army Air Forces. In early May, a technical team from Wright Field arrived at Ramitelli to evaluate Jackson's innovation. After extensive testing and documentation, they recommended standardization across all P-51 groups in the European theater. By June, the Jackson Mixture Control modification, as it was officially designated, was being implemented in fighter groups throughout the 8th and 15th Air Forces. For Technical Sergeant William Pressure Jackson, the recognition brought mixed emotions. Pride in his achievement, certainly, but also a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his work had directly contributed to the war effort and had saved the lives of pilots who might otherwise have been lost to fuel exhaustion over enemy territory. The technical challenge had been solved not through revolutionary innovation, but through careful observation, methodical testing, and the courage to challenge established procedures when circumstances warranted. In his hometown of Macon, Georgia, the local newspaper ran a small article about his Bronze Star, though it was relegated to the colored news section on the back pages. His parents carefully clipped the article and framed it, displaying it prominently in their living room, alongside his graduation certificate from Atlanta Technical School. In a segregated society that offered limited recognition for black achievement, it was a tangible symbol of their son's contributions to the country that had so often denied him equal opportunity. Back at Ramitelli, life for Jackson returned to its normal rhythm of maintenance, repairs, and the constant pressure of supporting combat operations. The 322nd continued its distinguished service as one of the premier escort groups in the European theater, its red-tailed P-51s, a welcome sight to bomber crews venturing into the dangerous skies over Nazi Germany. But something had changed, not just in the performance of the aircraft, but in the dynamics of the group itself. The successful implementation of Jackson's modification had reinforced a core truth that the men of the 322nd had always known, but that others were slower to recognize. Excellence knew no color, and innovation could come from anyone with the skill and determination to pursue it. In the enlisted men's mess one evening in late June, Jackson sat with Master Sergeant Wilson, discussing the day's maintenance challenges over cups of bitter Army coffee. They had developed a genuine respect for each other in the weeks since the fuel modification had been implemented, with Wilson acknowledging Jackson's technical genius and Jackson appreciating Wilson's vast experience and organizational skills. "Heard from right field today," Wilson mentioned casually. "They've standardized your modification for all P-51s in production now. It's part of the factory configuration." Jackson looked up from his coffee, surprised. "They didn't tell me that." Wilson shrugged. "They don't always inform the originator when an idea gets absorbed into the system. But it's official. Every new P-51 coming off the assembly line has the Jackson mixture control installed." "Doesn't seem right that they're not even telling him," interjected Staff Sergeant Robert Lee Johnson, another mechanic who had been listening to the conversation. "White boy comes up with something like that, they'd probably name the whole damn airplane after him." Wilson gave Johnson a warning look. "We're fighting for the right to be judged on our merits, not for special treatment. The modification is being implemented. It's saving lives, and it's officially recognized as Jackson's work. That's what matters." Jackson nodded in agreement. "He's right, Johnson. I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because it needed to be done, because it could help our pilots complete their missions and make it home safely. Everything else is just paperwork." Johnson looked unconvinced but let the matter drop. Later, as Jackson walked back to his quarters under a star-filled Italian sky, he reflected on Wilson's words. The struggle for equality wasn't about demanding special recognition or preferential treatment. It was about the opportunity to contribute, to have one's work judged on its merits, rather than prejudged based on race. In that sense, the adoption of his fuel system modification represented a small but significant victory, a recognition based purely on technical excellence rather than the color of the inventor's skin. Lieutenant Harrison, passing by on his way to the officers' club, fell into step beside him. "Evening Pressure heard the news about your modification becoming standard issue?" "Word travels fast," Jackson replied with a smile. "Good news usually does. The 352nd Fighter Group sent a message today thanking us for the game-changing fuel system. Apparently, they escorted a bombing mission to Leipzig yesterday, and every single aircraft made it back to base without refueling, even after extended combat. The group commander specifically mentioned your name." Jackson was momentarily taken aback. The 352nd was one of the premier fighter groups in the 8th Air Force, with an impressive combat record. That they would acknowledge the contribution of a black technical sergeant from a segregated fighter group was unexpected. "That's good to hear," he managed. Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "It's more than good, Pressure. It's a sign that things are changing. Slowly maybe, but changing nonetheless. Excellence speaks for itself regardless of where it comes from." As Harrison continued toward the officers' club, Jackson stood for a moment, looking up at the stars. The war had created unexpected opportunities, breaking down barriers that might otherwise have remained firmly in place. It wasn't equality, not yet, but it was a step in that direction, a recognition that talent and ability transcended the artificial boundaries of race and segregation. In the coming months, the Jackson mixture control modification would play a small but significant role in the Allied air campaign over Europe. The extended range it provided allowed fighter escorts to accompany bombers deeper into enemy territory, reducing losses and increasing the effectiveness of strategic bombing. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the modification had been implemented in over 500 P-51 Mustangs across the European theater. For Technical Sergeant William "Pressure" Jackson, the war's end brought both pride in what had been accomplished and uncertainty about what would follow. Like many black servicemen, he returned to a United States still firmly in the grip of segregation, where his wartime contributions were often overlooked or minimized. He used his GI Bill benefits to complete a degree in mechanical engineering at Howard University, eventually finding work in the automotive industry, where his innovations continued, though rarely with the recognition they deserved. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group, both pilots and ground crew, carried with them the knowledge that they had not only fought external enemies, but had also challenged and disproven the prejudices of their own society. Their record spoke for itself: 15 0 sorties, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed, and one of the lowest loss records of any escort fighter group in the war. They had demonstrated, in the most demanding circumstances imaginable, that courage, skill, and innovation recognized no color line. Decades later, long after segregation had officially ended in the United States military, the story of the Red Tail Angels and their remarkable achievements would finally receive the wider recognition it deserved. Among those achievements, the fuel system modification developed by a young mechanic from Macon, Georgia, would be noted as an example of the technical excellence that characterized the Tuskegee program from its inception. In aviation museums and Air Force technical manuals, the Jackson mixture control would be acknowledged as an important wartime innovation that extended the combat radius of America's premier fighter aircraft at a crucial phase of the air war over Europe. More significantly, it would stand as a testament to the principle that drove the Tuskegee Airmen from the beginning: given equal opportunity, there were no limits to what they could achieve. In the spring of 1990, at a reunion of the 382nd Fighter Group in Detroit, an elderly William Jackson, now retired after a distinguished career as an automotive engineer, was approached by a much younger Air Force captain who served as a technical officer with the modern Air Force's F-15 program. "Mr. Jackson," the captain said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to meet you. I've studied your fuel system modification as part of my technical training. It's still considered a textbook example of field expedient engineering under combat conditions." Jackson, his hair now white but his eyes still sharp, shook the offered hand with a smile. "Just solving a problem that needed solving, Captain. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective." "That's what they teach us," the captain agreed. "But they also teach us something else about your work, that innovation can come from anywhere, from anyone, regardless of rank or background. That's a lesson that goes beyond engineering." Jackson nodded, understanding the deeper significance of what the young officer was saying. In a way, his fuel system modification had been about more than just extending the range of fighter aircraft. It had been about extending the boundaries of opportunity, about demonstrating that excellence knew no color, and that when barriers were removed, talents that might otherwise have remained hidden could emerge to make contributions that benefited everyone. "I appreciate that, Captain," he said simply. "It's good to know the lesson hasn't been forgotten." As the reunion continued around them, with old comrades sharing stories of missions long past, Jackson reflected on the journey that had brought him from the segregated South to the maintenance hangars of Ramitelli Air Base, and ultimately to recognition as an innovator whose work had helped shape the outcome of a global conflict. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been a meaningful one, part of a larger struggle for equality and opportunity that continued to this day. The technical problem he had solved, extending the range of P-51 fighters through a more efficient fuel mixture, had been relatively straightforward. The social barriers he and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen had challenged were far more complex and resistant to change. Yet in both cases, persistence, excellence, and a refusal to accept artificial limitations had eventually prevailed. As he looked around at the men of the 332nd, now in their 70s but still proud of what they had accomplished, Jackson knew that their legacy went far beyond the missions they had flown or the aircraft they had maintained. They had proven, in the most demanding circumstances imaginable, that given equal opportunity, there were no limits to what could be achieved. That legacy, more than any technical innovation or combat victory, was their most enduring contribution to the nation they had served with such distinction. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.